All right, welcome back everyone. Today we are wrapping up sexual selection and we're going to be covering sort of mate preferences and how that can drive evolution. So let's start with a knowledge check. I'd like you to think back to the last module and define the 4 different ways that members of the same sex can compete with each other for mates. So what are the 4 forms of intersexual selection? And for at least 2 of them, I'd like you to list or describe the types of traits that might evolve under this form of selection. So go ahead and take a minute to do that. All right, so the 4 forms were contests, alternative mating strategies, gamete competition, and then infanticide. Contests are like direct combat between individuals of the same sex, and they can lead to things like traits like large size or horns, any sort of weapon that gives them any increase in fitness, any increase in chance of winning the competition and thus increasing their fitness. We also talked about alternative mating strategies where members of the same sex use different strategies to try to acquire mates. So in here, you might see traits like large territory defending males or individuals. It doesn't have to be males. Versus like sneaky males, which could be, they could evolve traits to look like females or look like members of the other sex. Or they could just be fast and small, right? And just kind of get through without the other male noticing. Gamete competition is competition between the gametes of individuals of the same sex to fertilize a set of gametes of the other sex. And so that can lead things to traits like producing more gametes. Or it could lead to copulatory plugs. Or we talked about tools to remove sperm of other males. In this case, it's usually sperm competition. Mate guarding, right? We talked about a lot of different traits that could evolve through this mechanism. And then the final one, form of intrasexual selection, is infanticide. So the trait there is really just being able to tell which young is yours. And possibly also things like large size, something that might help you defeat the other parent, because the other parent is not going to want you to kill their offspring, right? So you have to kind of overcome that parent. This is a moment of sexual conflict, right, where the interests of the sexes are not aligned. The parent of that offspring wants to keep it alive. So again, some of the things that would evolve through contests might also evolve here. All right, we didn't really talk too much about that, but that's possible. Or traits that help you win against parent trying to keep offspring alive. So grim, but those are the kind of selection pressures that exist in nature, right? All right, so that was our last module. In this module, we're going to talk about intersexual selection, where members of the same sex who invest more in offspring actively discriminate among potential mates of the sex who invest less. So discriminating means choosing. So this is choice, where one sex is choosing among members of another sex. And there are kind of 3 reasons that choice could evolve. And that are these 3: providing direct benefits, advertising good genes, and beauty for the sake of beauty, which is also called Fisher's runaway selection. But you're going to see this might help you remember it better. All right. So we're going to go through each of these and talk about why it exists, what are the benefits of the preference, why did it evolve? All right, so let's start with direct benefits. Direct benefits means the provisioning of mates with resources that increase their survival and reproductive success. All right. So you convince someone to mate with you by providing them resources. And those resources can be a lot of different things. So they could be protection. It's it reminds me a little bit of a mob boss, this one. So protection, access to territories, or maybe nest sites. Maybe you've built a nest and you're giving your mate access to that nest. Food. And maybe you help raise the young. So you're a little bit like the Godfather. People come to you for resources. That's what you're good for, right? So here's an example. The katydid, which is in this picture. Female katydids receive a really big spermatophore, which is, let me change the color here so you could actually see my circle, which is here during mating. So a spermatophore has sperm, but it also has a bunch of other stuff. And usually it is not that big. And so this one is huge. And this is a form of mate provisioning because there's a lot of nutrients in that spermatophore and the female is going to eat it. All right, so females can tell how big a spermatophore is going to be depending on the male by their song. Bigger males produce bigger spermatophores and they have a deeper song. So she's listening to the songs of different males, trying to figure out who's bigger, because the bigger male is going to provide her a more nutritious meal, essentially, and transfer sperm. But she's going to get sperm in either case, so she might as well also get the food, right? Because the food's going to help her survive and help her provision her eggs, right? So that's one example. So let's put it in words. Whenever potential mates provide an individual with direct benefits, if it is possible to distinguish good providers from poor providers. Then selection favors the development of a preference for the trait that allows you to distinguish this. As this ability increases an individual's fitness. Okay. And by individual, we mean here the individual who invests in offspring. So the choosy sex is the one that invests in the offspring, right? And so here again are the potential benefits of choice. Okay, and this is how choice evolves, right? So we have to see differences in fitness, and we do. So if you cannot tell apart a good provider from a bad provider, then you're going to mate at random. Sometimes you're going to get a good provider, sometimes you're going to get a bad. But if you can figure out a good provider from a bad provider, you're going to mate with a good provider consistently, which means you're probably going to leave more offspring because you have access to more resources, right? Like protection, territories, more food, or even help, right? So your lineage is going to spread. The lineage that can tell good providers from bad providers is going to spread, and the other lineage is going to decline, right? So over time, we expect to see a preference evolve. All right, let's look at another example. Okay, so hanging flies, so another insect. In hanging flies, a male catches an insect, and then he hangs from a twig and releases pheromones to try to attract females. When a female approaches, he presents his prey to her, and if she accepts it, they copulate while she eats the prey item. All right, so just looking at this example, we can see a couple direct benefits to the female. First, female gets a nutritious meal. And related to this, female is saved time and risk of having to hunt herself. So two related benefits to the female that are direct, right? They impact her survival and reproduction, okay? So we see a benefit to the female for having the preference, but is there a benefit to the male? Because remember, it's the individuals who invest less in the offspring who tend to be mate limited, whereas it's the individuals who invest more in the offspring who tend to be gamete limited. So they don't have to mate very often or get that many gametes to be successful. So let's see if there's a benefit for the male of providing resources. All right, so here's two figures. The first one is body size of the prey. and the duration of copulation. So how long is copulation, depending on the body of the prey. The second one is duration of copulation and number of sperm transferred. So again, a couple questions are going to pop up, and I want you to work through them to see if you think that males have an advantage for providing resources to females. All right, so let's talk through these. From the first graph, we see that, especially in this early part of the graph, we see a positive slope, right, between the body size of the prey and duration of copulation. That relationship kind of breaks off at like 20, but at least here, you want to have a body size of your prey that's at least 20 millimeters to increase the length of copulation. All right, so there does seem to be a benefit. The bigger the prey item you provide, the longer it takes her to eat and the longer you copulate. So the larger the longer the female eats, and the longer the pair copulates. So does longer copulations matter? That's what our second graph here is about. So duration of copulation is related here to sperm transfer. So we can see that really short copulations, so ones that are like 5 minutes or less, no sperm transfer. And then we see this, right, again, a positive slope that says as duration of copulation gets longer, the number of sperm transferred gets larger. And then that relationship seems to break off at 20 minutes. Because you've passed pretty much all the sperm that you can pass. Okay? So what that says is that the longer the pair copulates, the more sperm the female accepts from the male. Okay, so there's an advantage, right? If she's got a bunch of eggs, the more sperm that you pass, the more of them you're going to fertilize, especially if she happened to mate again, right? You want to make sure that it's your sperm and not another that fertilizes the eggs. And this is especially important to at least have a big enough prey item that you engage in copulation for at least 5 minutes, because otherwise you don't transfer any sperm. And you lost that prey item because she ate it. And then here's a little additional information to help you think about reproductive success of males. So in addition, researchers have found if the female finishes prey item before 20 minutes, she will break off copulation. Right, which this part explains the trend line that we see here. That we see here. But here's the other part of it. She will then mate with another male to get another meal. So if you don't provide the female enough food, she moves on to another male to get some more food. And now you're increasing your risk of gamete competition. So there is an advantage to males, right, to provide larger prey items to the females. So that is how choice drives the evolution of the male trait of what size prey it tries to capture and offer to females. And I wanted to hit on this. It's not common, but it's just kind of a fun example. Sexual cannibalism, so where one mate eats the other one, you don't often think of that as to the advantage of the mate, but it can be, right? So sexual cannibalism is a form of direct benefits. The benefit is the nutrients in mate's body, right? So you're consuming the mate and you're getting all the nutrients that are in that body. So that's the benefit to individual invested in offspring. So what's the benefit to the mate limited individual, right? The one who wants to mate multiply. Well, for one, it lengthens sometimes copulation. And it does this because sometimes as female consumes male, so in this case we're talking about like these redback spiders. I don't think the praying mantis does this. As the female consumes the male, he continues to transfer sperm. So we saw in the last example that the longer copulation occurs, the more sperm that can be transferred. By being eaten and essentially distracting the female with your nutrients, that means copulation can continue for a longer time. Another benefit is that in a lot of these species, the chance the male will mate with a second mate is generally low. These are the kinds of systems that would evolve sexual cannibalism. And so this behavior then benefits male because he's provisioning his offspring, and longer copulations. Okay, so this may not be a case of sexual conflict, right? The sexes involved in this may be aligned. So for example, the redback spiders, there was a group doing a project on them. But the redback spiders, the male will actually do this backflip to expose his body. So while he's copulating, he does this weird little backflip thing to expose himself to the female's mouth so that she kills him. So he wouldn't have evolved that if it wasn't to his advantage, right? So again, we always have to remember that evolution doesn't care about you, right? It doesn't care about your life or continuing your life. It cares about what you leave in the next generation. So if offspring number is maximized by you dying, then evolution is going to select for that and lead to traits that encourage that. Okay? Evolution, it's not kind. So those are our examples of direct benefits. Now we're going to talk about the other two cases where preference can involve, and both of these are indirect benefits or involve indirect benefits. And indirect benefits are benefits that affect the genetic quality of offspring such that the offspring of the mate limited sex are more desirable to the next gen of the resource limited sex. Okay, so the difference here is who gets the benefit. So mates do not provide direct benefits. Okay, instead, by mating with attractive mates, the resource limited sex enhances the quality of their offspring in some way. So direct benefits are benefits that go to the mate. Indirect benefits are going to the offspring, okay? But benefits that go to your offspring also increase your fitness, because if your lineage spreads, right, if your offspring leave more offspring, then your lineage has higher fitness, right? So essentially, the benefits of your grandchildren are what the payoff is from indirect benefits, that you'll have more grandchildren. All right, so what are the origins of these preferences? Because remember, these preferences have to be under natural selection, because the the resource limited sex is not under sexual selection. Whatever the preference is impacts and drives sexual selection on the mate limited sex, but the resource limited sex is under natural selection. So, what are origins of preferences based on indirect benefits? And again, the reason I'm focusing on resource limited sex, or trying to, sometimes I slip up, resource limited sex and mate limited sex, is because we don't know, remember, which sex it's going to be. In some species, males invest more ultimately in offspring because they're providing a lot of parental care, and in other species, females invest more. In fact, my dissertation thesis was on male mate choice in salamanders. So males would dance more for a larger female to try to be attractive. So it was sort of a mutual mate choice thing going on. But he was making the choice of how much energy to invest to send his signal depending on how attractive the female was. All right? So it's not female choice, male-male competition like some intro textbooks might say. It's more complicated than that, right? It all depends on who's resource limited versus who's mate limited, who's investing the most in the offspring. You have to know the natural history of your system. So we also want to remember, when we're talking about the origin of preference, that preference is in the resource limited sex. And so, not under sexual selection. It has to evolve by natural selection. Once present, the preference creates a sexual selection pressure on the mate-limited sex. This is why we kind of covered sexual selection last, because it's complicated, right? Because there's always two players. A lot of our natural selection examples were kind of focused on one player, right? Whoever was evolving. But in this case, there's really two things evolving, right? The preference and the trait that's under the sexual selection from the preference. All right, so there's really two explanations for where these preferences come from. And that's what we're going to go through. The first is called the good genes hypothesis. And the second is Fisherian runaway selection. So let's start with good genes. So we're going to work through this in a case study. So let's talk about the three-spined stickleback. In the three-spined stickleback, females prefer males with red coloration. You can see the red in the picture here. And in this system, there's no evidence that males provide any direct benefits to the female. So we can ask the question, well, then why in the world did this preference evolve, right? What is the selective advantage for the female of this preference? So researchers did an experiment. They bred females with two different males, so one with a lot of red and one with very little red. And so because the offspring have the same mother, only the father's genetics would vary, right? So if you're looking at the offspring, you could look at the offspring of father 1 and the offspring of father 2. And they exposed these offspring to tapeworm larvae and then measured how many of the offspring got infected. So then they graphed their data. So on the x-axis here, we have the redness of the father. So how red is he? And it's kind of a percent red. And then we've got offspring infected by the tapeworm. So what percent of the offspring of each redness level were infected by tapeworms. Okay, so a question is going to pop up for you once I give you the data. Great. So what I hope you saw from this graph, or concluded from this graph, is that the offspring of more brightly colored males and the bright color is red, displayed higher resistance to infection. So color, which is the trait selection based on indicated something, right? Indicated to the female that mate had some sort of good genes that would make their offspring more fit. So that is the good genes hypothesis. The idea here is that some traits are correlated with increased fitness and indicate genetic quality of mates. So if you're wandering around Miami, you may notice actually that there's a lot of in particular males who are red. So like cardinals, bright red. Anoles have oranges and reds on their throat patch, on their dewlap that they use to signal. Red is often an honest, what we call an honest indicator. It really is telling you about the fitness, the quality of that individual. And that is because red is not something the body can make itself. Red is based on carotenoids, and carotenoids you have to get from your food. So carotenoids show that they're a good gatherer of resources, that they have a good territory potentially, right, with lots of food. And if carotenoids are also involved, it seems like, in the immune system. So they must have a good immune system if they have all these carotenoids in their body. So the implication here is that if females prefer red males, then the red tells them about the immune system, right? And so if the male is then passing good genes on, right, something that gives him a quality immune system onto the female's offspring, then her offspring are going to survive better than average, right, and increase her fitness. It's all about what you leave in the next generation. Okay? So the benefit of the fitness, the benefit of having this preference is that the traits preferred indicate mate quality and thus increase offspring fitness. Pretty cool. So how preference evolves. So the preference evolves through natural selection. Preference for a trait that advertises good genes gets correlated with those good genes. Right? So if you prefer good genes, you're going to mate with if you prefer a particular trait and that trait indicates good genes, by chance, you are producing offspring that have both the preference and the genes, right? So you're going to end up correlating the preference with the genes. And so how this works, to just give another example, so resource-limited sex mates with mate with good gene, and passes their preference. So passes preference and good genes to their offspring. I hope that makes sense. So once that happens, stronger preference will evolve as a side effect on the good genes. So once they're correlated and in the same individual, then their fate are tied together. So weak preferences that aren't related to good genes, those individuals might die because they don't have good genes, right? It's only the lineages that produce good genes that spread in the population, which means the preference that leads to those lineages having good genes also spreads in the population. Okay? So that's how the preference evolves. How does the trait evolve? That's sexual selection, and that's actually the easier thing to understand. So individuals with trait indicating good genes are preferred by mates, right? So in the competition to be attractive, they are winning and thus have a higher reproductive success. Okay, so that's good genes. Fisher's runaway selection is almost kind of the opposite idea. So mate preference is completely arbitrary. And by arbitrary, I mean neutral in regard to natural selection. So the trait isn't an indicator of anything. The idea here is that they're merely beautiful. don't mean anything. Individuals just like what they like. So there have been a lot of studies that have tried to show that good genes drive the traits that females choose among in males, or that good genes drive the traits that males choose among in females. But a lot of those studies can't show that. And so, especially in birds, this is common, but any system where you see a very elaborate courtship display, the question is every element of that courtship display actually giving real information? And some researchers, originally Ronald Fisher, who was a terrible human, but came up with some good ideas about statistics and also evolution, but terrible. Came up with this idea that maybe preference is arbitrary. There's just some trait that the individuals, the resource-limited individuals in this population like. They just like it because they like it, not because it indicates good genes. Okay, so trait does, in this case, trait does not need to indicate anything about mate quality, nor does it have to increase offspring survival, to spread. So this trait can spread even if it has no information about mate quality and it doesn't increase offspring survival. All it needs to spread is for the mate to prefer it. Why evolutionary biologists can get kind of obsessed about Fisher's runaway selection is it's really the force that explains how we can end up with traits that reduce the survival of individuals under sexual selection. So for example, this bird here has an incredibly long tail. That long tail makes it a pretty poor flyer, but that tail is what females prefer. So sexual selection is acting the opposite of natural selection, and Fisher's runaway selection can explain why that happens. So traits could even reduce survival of individual expressing it. As long as it's preferred by mates. The only thing we have to assume for Fisher's runaway selection is the preference and the trait have a genetic basis. Which we are honestly assuming for all of these models of mate choice, because we have to have postulate 2 hold. Okay, So the benefit of this preference is sometimes short-handed, and I'm going to use it because it's easy to remember, into the phrase sexy sons. It's not always sons, right? It depends on the system, but basically the benefit to a female of having this preference is that their offspring are attractive. So their offspring don't have higher fitness. It's not like that. They don't have a higher quality in terms of like immune system or whatever. They just are attractive. They're pretty. All right, so let's talk about how this evolves, all right? How does this preference for beauty alone evolve? All right, so let's start with this. Let's assume population varies in expression of male trait. And in our example, we're going to be amount of red. And population varies in female preference for that trait. So basically some prefer more red than others. Okay, so specifically, what you're going to see in that case, if we look over at this graph, the top two graphs kind of show you what we're talking about here. So here's the parent generation right here. And we see variation in preference. So here's the female who hearts a little bit of red, and here's a female who hearts a lot of red. And we can see that the majority of females seem to heart an intermediate amount of red. But there's a spread there, right? And then if you go down one, and we're looking now at the males in this population, we see there's variation in the trait. So variation in the preference and variation in the trait. There are males with very little red and males with a lot red. So females who prefer the extreme trait which in this case is more red, mate with males with extreme trait. And females who prefer minimal trait mate with males with minimal trait. So I want you to see if you can think through the implications of this sort of assortative mating. All right, so a couple questions are going to pop up. Let's see how you do on them. All right, good luck. Okay, so let's come back together and kind of debrief that. So what we're seeing is that the act, whoops, I just dropped my pen. The action of mate choice means the variation in genes for the preference and genes for the trait will no longer be found at random in the population. I.e., there is assortative mating for preference and display. And we saw this in good genes as well. So basically, I hope what you saw in this question is that if you prefer red, so let's say you have a strong preference for red, you are going to mate with a red male and produce sons who are red. If you prefer moderate red, like half the male is red, then you're going to mate with a male who is half red and you're going to produce sons who are half red. If you prefer males with very little red, then you're going to mate with a male with very little red and produce sons that have very little red. So basically, you're creating a correlation between the preference in the daughters. So you're in your offspring, your offspring are going to have the preference for a lot of red and the genes for a lot of red, right? But one's expressed in your daughters and one's expressed in your sons. Or if you don't like red, you're going to have the preference for no red in your daughters and the no red in your sons. Okay? So you're correlating the two traits, which means you're going to see fewer individuals will carry a preference for more red and the genes for less red, right? So you're not getting these individuals are not reproducing. They're leaving the population. They're not leaving behind as many offspring. These individuals are not reproducing. So essentially you're smushing the population towards that line. It is in a way that correlational selection that we've talked about in the modes of selection. Okay? More individuals will carry a preference for more red and the genes for more red. Thus, across generations, preference and display become genetically correlated. And that just means if you inherit one, you inherit the other. If you inherit a preference for more red, you're also inheriting the genes to have more red. And then you can get into this positive feedback loop where mate choice becomes selective agent in the evolution of mate choice. So mate choice in one generation reinforces mate choice in the next generation and actually can drive stronger and stronger preference for red. All right? So both for this and for good genes, I highly recommend you try to explain it to yourself as you study in the exam how these preferences evolve. And if you struggle with that, and it's hard, and I struggle with it, I still struggle with it. But if you struggle with it, come chat with me during office hours. I'm happy to talk about it. I think it's fascinating, and I'm happy to help you try to think through it. Okay, to try to help you visualize this again and how it's different than good genes, here's a quote from Dr. Prume, who wrote the book The Evolution of Beauty, which is very much around Fisher's runaway selection in birds. He studies this. Fisher's runaway selection is rather like high fashion. The difference between successful and unsuccessful clothes is determined not by variation in function or objective quality of those clothes, but by ideas about what is subjectively appealing, whatever the style is of the season. Right? So fashion, like basic clothes, the clothes we wear every day, the clothes we wear to work in, the clothes we wear to survive, what's natural selection, right, is all about function and quality, right? Who's got a good immune system? Who's got, who can run faster than the predator? But Fisher's runaway is about style, is about beauty. It's not based on fitness in this way, right? Not based on survival. All right, so Fisher's model of mate choice results in the evolution of traits that lack any functional advantage, like this super long tail, no functional advantage. So they lack functional advantage, and it may even disadvantage the displayer, like stylish shoes that hurt one's feet. What drives Fisherian selection is desire itself. That is, something is desirable because it is desired, popular because it's popular, not because it's functional. All right, so that's really the big difference here between good genes and direct benefits and Fisherian selection. All right, so the last big idea with Fisher's runaway selection is that sexual selection via runaway selection can push traits beyond their natural selection optimum. This is how costly traits evolve. Okay, so let's talk about this. So we've got a natural selection optimum for the amount of red an individual should have, right? It may be that having a lot of red makes you stand out across the background and gets you killed. So there's some level of red that is the natural selection optimum. So that's this line. Okay, so if you get above this line, NS is pushing you back. If you get below this line, natural selection is pushing you up to the line, right? This is the optimum. Now, we already established that sexual selection also may have an optimum. It could be something like this, where daughters have a really strong preference for red, and then others have a preference for no red. So in either case, again, out here, sexual selection is pushing you up. And down here, natural sexual selection is pushing you down. So you can see, depending on where we are in the graph, that natural selection and sexual selection are opposing each other. And so what you get is a compromise. And that compromise depends on the relative force of sexual and natural selection. So actual observed preferences is a balance between two selective pressures. But sexual selection, no matter where we are on this line, except this one point where they all overlap, sexual selection has pushed the trait beyond its natural selection optimum. So it is costly. It is impacting the survival of the sons. Okay? So this is how you get costly traits. Sexual selection, depending on the strength of the preference, can push a trait beyond its natural selection optimum. All right, so that is sexual selection. So to wrap up our last unit on, that is intersexual selection. And to wrap up our last unit on sexual selection, I want you to compare and contrast these three forms of mate preference. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this unit. I think it is some of the coolest stuff that we talk about in undergrad, personally, my bias. And it's also some of the most challenging. So again, the exam is coming up, so please stop by office hours. I'll probably have more office hours next week than average, but take advantage of them. I'm there, I'm bored, I'm just standing there. So please join me and ask questions, all right? I really want you to get this stuff. All right, well, have a good rest of the week, and hopefully I will talk to you all next week. Bye.